Welcome. My name is Jim Neal. I'm the University Librarian at Columbia University, and we are the sponsor, the Friends of the Library, of this event this evening. Please consider joining the Friends. It enables us to put on events like this, and it also helps us to make the libraries at Columbia and the work of our faculty and students so much better through your support. This event is billed as Robert K. Merton at 100, Reflections and Recollections. We've invited a very distinguished panel of individuals who have known and worked with Dr. Merton, and will reflect this evening on their experiences with Mr. Merton as scholar, teacher, mentor, and colleague. We do this tonight because we have just completed the processing of the Robert Merton papers, which were contributed to the libraries at Columbia University and are available through the Rare Book and Manuscript Library in Butler Library. We also chose to do it now because it is the 100th anniversary of Robert Merton's birth, and it seemed the appropriate time, that confluence of events, for us to celebrate that extraordinary career. After tonight's panel discussion and your opportunity to raise some questions and share some comments, we're going to ask you to consider walking briefly across campus to the Butler Library, where we will have a reception in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which is on the 6th floor of Butler. There also is an exhibit drawn from the Robert Merton collection, so you'll have an opportunity to see some of the wonderful materials that will be available for scholarship. I would also add that we have a fantastic exhibit on the work of Joseph Urban as well, and I think you will find that extremely exciting and interesting. It was reported and celebrated in the New York Times, so it's gotten a lot of recognition. I'd like to introduce Harriet Zuckerman. Harriet will serve as the host and convener and speaker, lead speaker at this panel this evening. She is the Professor Emeritus of Columbia University, and most recently, Senior Vice President of the Mellon Foundation. I was amazed when I reached into the Mellon website and I found, when it noted her retirement, that over her career at Mellon, the foundation she joined in 1991, she had been responsible for 1,400 grants to 206 organizations, representing $775 million of extraordinary investment in the work of higher education and the work of research and scholarship. Before joining the foundation, she was professor of sociology here at Columbia, where she chaired the department from 78 to 82. She received her AB from Vassar and her PhD from Columbia. As we know, her research has focused on the social organization of science and scholarship. Her books and her journal papers are extraordinary. I would note her authorship of Scientific Elite, Nobel laureates in the United States, and her co-editorship of another volume, The Outer Circle, Women in the Scientific Community. Earlier this year, we invited her to come to Columbia to speak about an important book she had co-authored with Princeton University Press, Educating Scholars, Doctoral Education in the Humanities. She is a trustee of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, on the board of directors of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Social Sciences Research Council. She's a member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We are thankful to Harriet for making Robert Merton's papers available to the students and scholars and to researchers from around the world, and we are very appreciative for her willingness to join us tonight to offer the opening talk and to convene the panel. Harriet.
I didn't imagine there would be an obstacle course to get here. When Michael Ryan, who is the director of the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, and Jim Neal, who you have just heard, who is Columbia's chief librarian, broached the possibility to me of a celebration, a joint celebration, of the opening of what those who look at it will see is a truly elegant, professionally organized archive, and the 100th anniversary of Bob's death. How could I not agree, and agree so quickly that I think I must have shocked them? It was clear from the outset that this was not to be an occasion for critical assessment of Bob's work. Conferences here and abroad have been held for that purpose, and a spate of books have been published on his work, one just out, which is sitting in front of Professor Bailyn and Professor Stigler, and one about to appear. Michael and I thought instead what we might do was, with a very gentle suggestion to the speakers, who we would not dream of telling what to say, that they might focus on the aspect of Bob, the man and the thinker, that was less visible to people. Not exactly the private Merton, but the not-so-public Merton. Well, each of the speakers will, of course, say what he wants to say. And my job, as Jim Neal said, is to introduce the speakers, to try to keep some order among them, and then, Jim, I will be the cleanup hitter. Where are you? I will not start the occasion. Now, I will therefore introduce the speakers in order, beginning with Professor Bernard Bailyn. He is Adams University Professor of History Emeritus and James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History Emeritus at Harvard. For decades now, Bud Bailyn has been a doyen of American history. His multiple Pulitzer Prizes, his Bancroft Prize, his National Book Award, and more honorary degrees than I could even recite before we all had to go home, attest to his standing, though I have to say I was especially pleased, Bud, as I told you, that Columbia conferred an honorary Doctor of Letters on you this past June. Now, Bud, and I have to say, it is no disrespect that I call him Bud, all his friends do, is literally a member of the family. He married Lottie Lazarsfeld, who I know is here, I saw her come in, who is, of course, the daughter of Paul Lazarsfeld and Mitzi Yehoda, who were, Paul being Bob's closest friend and longest collaborator and fellow builder of Columbia sociology. But it's not only the academic and the familial ties that bind us here to Bud. He has a special place in the Mertonian story for having served as the, if you'll allow me, unwitting inspiration of Bob's favorite book, On the Shoulders of Giants. Bud.
Is this working? Yeah. Oh, thanks. Well, it's an honor to be here to say just a few words about Bob Merton. I will refer to these people by their first names. As Harriet just said, my connection is a little personal in the way she described, but I have to say to begin with that my encounters with Bob Merton have always been rather dramatic. There's something dramatic about all of these encounters, and they began very early, years and years and years ago, when I was a graduate student, and believe me, that was a long time ago. I had become engaged to Lottie Lazarsfeld, as Harriet has said, and Paul Lazarsfeld was even then a very, very close collaborator with Bob Merton. They were great friends. They saw each other continuously in the Department of Sociology and in the Bureau of Applied Social Research. And it was therefore incumbent upon Paul to present his prospective son-in-law to Bob Merton. And so it was arranged that I was presented to the Mertons, who were very kind and invited us to dinner at their house on Hastings-on-Hudson. Lottie's mother was in town. She was then professor of psychology at NYU. And so it was arranged. Lottie and I were staying with her mother on her apartment on Fifth Avenue and 8th Street. And so it was arranged. I had my car, and we picked up Mitzi, as she was called, and Lottie, and we drove up to West 86th Street and picked Paul up and drove out to Hastings on the highway. Now, you have to understand, I was quite apprehensive about this. Bob Merton was already a famous man, and I knew Paul's great friendship for him. And this was becoming quite a delicate affair. And I thought a good deal about this, and I did a little homework, and I read some of Bob Merton's stuff, and I got a better sense of his interests, and I said to myself, I better develop some ideas appropriate to this occasion. And so I did. And I got up some quite clever formulations, I may say. And as we drove along the highway, I worked out some very elegant things that I might toss casually into the conversation. And it was going along fine, and then a catastrophe happened. We ran out of gas. And I remember vividly the four of us there sitting in silent disbelief that such a stupid thing could have happened. But I made the most of it, and there was a gas station fairly near. So I got out, and I got a can of gas, and I got the car started. But then I have to tell you, I had run out of gas, not only physically, but emotionally at that point, and also intellectually. And by the time we got to Hastings to the Mertons, about 3/4 of an hour late, I was completely out of gas, and I have blanked out completely on that dinner. I have no recollection whatever of what happened. I've repressed the entire thing. That was my first encounter with Bob Merton. But he was a very generous man, and he had a great interest in the history I was doing, which was 17th century history, which he had written his dissertation on. And we got along fine, and he was a generous man. And we struck up a correspondence that went on for some years. And he was interested in what I was doing. I sent him manuscripts. He responded very kindly. He wrote notes on them, wonderful notes, directed me into areas I would never have dreamed of. And it was all really it was really an exceptionally interesting relationship that we had largely by mail until 1959. In 1959, Bob sent me a copy of his presidential address to the American Sociological Association. And it was an extremely elegant, as some of you know, address. And in it, he referred to Newton's reference to that phrase that we are dwarfs seated on the shoulders of giants and therefore can see farther than they. And in responding to the offprint he sent me, I wrote him a short note which I have with me, which is dated November 8th, 59, in which I commented on this, saying that he attributes to Newton, and said that in my study of medieval French history, I had found that that was referred to by Bernard of Chartres in the early 12th century. This was in the end of 1959. A year later, I got a letter from Bob in which he said that my little note had touched off his thinking on this subject, on which he had been collecting materials since 1942. And he decided to write an answer to my letter, which he had begun in Christmas, 1959, and he never finished it. But he said, well, he'll send it anyway. This was a year later. It had been sitting around. He said he's never going to finish this. So he sent it to me. And I have it here. It is a dittoed form, this letter, of 44 single-space pages. It is 20,000 words. It is the most erudite work of scholarship I had ever seen in my life. And it has all of the references that have ever been made in the whole of Western culture to this aphorism. And I have this purple duplicate of that he sent me, which is a precious item in my archive. And then I had the problem of trying to figure out how to respond to this letter. I was afraid if I sent him another little letter, God knows what I'd get. So instead, I tried a little Shandian trick of my own and wrote him a rather limping letter, considering the ways in which, if I were to have answered that letter, I might have done so. This was a little pale next to what I had received, but it was the best I could do. I then said that I was very much interested in this, particularly because of my interest in Lawrence Sterne. The Tristram Shandy book was written by Lawrence Sterne. Had I had a senior year in college, which I never did, I would have written my honors thesis on Lawrence Sterne, and I explained in this letter why I had switched to history in thinking about Sterne and his books. And Bob wrote me back another very thoughtful letter. Thank God it was not that long, but a very interesting letter in the ways in which people find themselves within the intellectual world. And I had found myself in history, and he wrote me a short discourse on how people do this. And it is a lovely letter, I must say, in response to me. At the bottom of which he said, people have suggested that he publish the letter he sent me as an essay, and what did I think about that? So I wrote back and I said, I think it's great, publish it, and put it in with your other essays, only not with the personal stuff, without the salutations. In other words, without me. Things were quiet for 4 years, and then in 1965 I got another package from Bob Merton, this time the published book. And there it is, that great book, on the shoulders, Atzog, as he referred to it, on the shoulders of giants. And to my horror, but then mixed pride, he had put my letter in it. And I couldn't figure out, and I have to confess to you, I still haven't figured out whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. And I didn't know whether to take pride in it or be embarrassed. But in any case, it is all there in this fabulous book, rambling on about the universe of that aphorism throughout the whole of Western culture. And it is a stunning book. As I say, everything with Merton was dramatic. But to turn more seriously about him, I have to say that I always thought of him in tandem, because I saw him, of course, with Paul all the time. Otherwise, I would not have known him at all. And I saw the two of these people working together, and I have to tell you, there never in human history has there been a more odd couple. Paul Lazarsfeld was Central Europe. He was the second Wiener Kreis. He was fluent and gregarious in 3 languages, equally well. He was the epitome of a Middle European gentleman. He was voluble, he was excitable, he was all over the place, and he was an academic operator such as I have never seen. One of his colleagues said that Paul Lazarsfeld thinks the way to buy a postage stamp is to fly to Washington and cut a deal with the Postmaster General. You know, that was, and Merton was the exact opposite. He was cool, he was collected, he was just as witty, but in an entirely different way. The two of them worked together to develop in tandem these two utterly different people, the most creative institute in social research, I think, that existed at the time. The Bureau of Applied Social Research, funded by the grants that Paul could get in, elevated to the level of sophistication that Bob could give it, was one of the great nurseries of scholarship of the post-war period. It was a great accomplishment. I can't go into it. Some of you probably worked in the Bureau at one point or know something about it. It was a marvelous accomplishment. And the two of them worked together. But the thing that struck me, I think, most about their relationship, which was so consistent over so many years, was the respect they had for each other. They were very different people. I cannot imagine that they went through these years of collaboration without conflict. They must have, but I wasn't aware of it. I was impressed especially by the respect they had for each other, which they documented. Each wrote a memoir of the other. Paul wrote a long and fascinating essay called Working with Merton in the Festschrift for Merton, and it is a book, it is an essay really worth studying. And Merton wrote a piece, not quite as long, but equally discerning on Paul after he died in a memorial book. And the two of them, the respect they had for each other and their sense of each other's qualities come out in those memoirs superbly well. Paul ended his, and I'll end this, with a simile. Paul was not a literary type, and his prose was, half of it was dictated, and he had no sense. Merton had a marvelous sense of language and of the uses of English. Paul didn't. But on this occasion, at the end, Paul did, in describing Merton as an intellectual, did move into a more literary phase in the following way. He said that Merton was very displeased with the way people were treating concepts. They didn't know how to deal with concepts. They were clumsy, and they were rough in handling. They tagged them, they gave them a name, they put it on a shelf. This was concept X, but they didn't really know what to do with the concept. Merton, Paul said, approached the concept as an expert approaches a precious gem and examines its exterior qualities, its shape, its coloration, the refraction it gets from concepts that are adjacent to it, and the way in which overall the intellectual heft of it can be understood, and then can find a fault line which he can crack and find within it the interior qualities of the gem. Now, The aspects of Merton's intellectual life are so vast, I couldn't begin to touch on it even if I knew enough. But that does seem to me to encapsulate the superb qualities that he had and that Lazarsfeld, I think, so wonderfully responded to. Thank you.
We turn now to Jonathan Cole. Jonathan is Columbia's former provost and dean of faculties, and now the John Mitchell Mason Professor of the university. He began this illustrious career as Bob's student. He became his dear friend, and he was, with a group of us, promoters of the sociology of science. He was the author of landmark studies, both by himself and with others, and I was one of those others. For example, on social stratification in science, women in science. Jim, attributed that book to me. It is, the Outer Circle is as much John's work as mine. And he struck out on his own to study legal decision-making. Most recently, no doubt because of his long stint as provost, he became very much concerned with the place of American universities in the society in which we live. His book that was published last year, The Great American Research University, has been reviewed here and abroad, and it is certainly clear to me that whenever people now get together to talk about research universities and their problems, Jonathan's book is at the center of the discussion. It is definitive. And it's definitive in that it's a statement either to be agreed with or argued with, which it has been, or both. Jonathan.
Thank you, Harriet. I'm delighted to be here this evening to celebrate this important intellectual event in the history of Columbia University, the official celebration of the opening of the Robert K. Merton Archives. Thanks to my dear friend and colleague of many years, Harriet Zuckerman, as well as to the brilliant work of the people at the Rare Books and Manuscript Library at Columbia, a treasure is opened to the world today. For those who knew Bob well and admired his intellectual practices and style, we knew that he was fond of the term truffle dogging. He admired those who had a nose for a good problem, could sniff it out and bring it to life with clarity and depth. He was, of course, an extraordinary editor and correspondent, a truffle dog himself, as well as a prolific writer of drafts of manuscripts not always published, and of teaching notes. He was a collector and connoisseur of scholarly works, and was simultaneously organized sufficiently well to color code file material, which he would squirrel away only to be able to retrieve them years later for the relevant showing and telling. Those who use these archives will find almost unlimited amounts of unique material and information about him, his work, his acquaintances, his role as eminence grise, and as much about the age in which he lived, which spanned a good deal of the 20th century. It will sustain and amuse and add enormously to the scholarly work of hundreds of those who visit and use this collection. I understand that my assignment tonight is not to focus principally on the substantive work of Merton that most of you here are familiar with, but to provide some limited insight into the other Merton, the aspects of this man that was not visible to everyone. that they might not fully appreciate. I shall try to stick to that assignment, but I can't refrain from talking about one serious sociological matter that I believe is linked to Merton, but that has not yet been well explored. Robert Merton was, of course, a giant among 20th century social scientists, not only sociologists. Both in print and in person, he had a profound influence on modern social science, and particularly in the study of bureaucracy, deviance, mass communications, social stratification, and the sociology of knowledge and of science. He created an American style of sociological inquiry, theories of the middle range, that linked theories closely with empirical testing. It's what made really his relationship with Paul so extraordinary. Paul wanted to be the theorist, and he wanted to be the empirical researcher. Turned out they were the opposite, of course. He was a consummate essayist and a lover of language, and he used it with such grace, tact, and analytic precision that many of the terms he coins have a deceptively self-evident clarity and have passed into common usage. I am thinking, of course, of the focus group, the Matthew effect, the perspective of the insider and outsider, and the self-fulfilling prophecy. The magic of Robert Merton reached audiences beyond sociology. His students populated the leading departments of sociology for several generations, and his larger influence was felt not only by historians of science, economists, political theorists, and anthropologists, but also made its way across disciplinary boundaries into the worlds of the sciences, humanities, and law. Despite his seminal contributions to many areas of sociological knowledge, Robert Merton's first scholarly love was the historical and sociological study of science. He was the father of the discipline. His Science, Technology, and Society of 17th Century England, originally published in Osiris, which was the 1938 published version of his Harvard doctoral dissertation, is almost certainly the most important sociological study ever produced. In August 1958, after 20 years spent cultivating other fields, Merton announced his return to the study of science in his renowned presidential address at the American Sociological Association, a talk entitled Priorities of Scientific Discovery, which Professor Bailyn alluded to. Many subsequent studies of the social system of science, of the ethos of science, and of the theoretical basis of conflicts over scientific priority followed from the ideas presented in that extraordinary address. For the next 30 years, Merton and his students developed and legitimated the study of science as a social institution. Although Merton's work touched on many disparate subjects, common theoretical elements and strategies knit them together into a highly coherent body of work. Whether focusing on the political machine or on the priority dispute between Newton and Leibniz over the invention of the calculus, Merton examined the ways in which social structures constrain and direct the choices of individuals and the way in which, in turn, their choices had institutional consequences. Why was it so difficult to root out the political machine? How did the emphasis on originality in science lead to deviance among scientists? Merton often found solutions by going at the problem from an odd angle, by turning away from received wisdom and from the language in which it was enshrined. He looked at the unintended consequences of actions, such as the way in which the ethos of Puritanism led to the growth of science in 17th century England. Merton naturally gravitated towards irony and paradox. In his famous paper, Social Structure and Anomie, he shows how an American virtue, the desire to succeed, to get ahead, creates an American vice, deviant behavior. He analyzed the ways in which political bosses do more good with less justice than the just government does when it fails to fulfill the social needs of people who are unable to navigate complex government bureaucracies. In the ironies of the unintended consequences of pattern behavior, Merton found the magic, the material that was there but could not be seen immediately by most observers, an explanatory magic that was not revealed to the reader until Bob was ready to pull the rabbit out of the hat. To begin to understand Bob, you had to accept the idea that the power of personality can be almost as influential as the power of intellect. Merton was not only a transcendent mind, but also a life force. He was a mesmerizing classroom teacher, a magician in front of would-be prestidigitators. I came to know Bob Merton as my teacher in the mid-1960s, first as an undergraduate auditor of one of his famous courses, Analysis of Social Structures, that was offered annually to over 150 students. The content of the course was often original from year to year. In it, Merton taught Mertonian theory. That is, he taught himself. The dramatic tension of RKM's classes was palpable. We witnessed the genesis, the evolution, and sometimes the extinction of ideas. Concepts of social structure were chiseled out, smoothed over, and used as building blocks for larger theories of social structure. Little of this material could be found in his or other published work, but I believe they will be found in the archive. There were dramatic reversals and denouements, disasters and triumphs, as students took stock and tried to establish their own identities through critical analyses of these Mertonianisms, I should say. We watched someone with the skill of Bobby Fischer toying with a Boris Spassky. We tried to follow along and anticipate the next 6 moves, but most often Merton seemed magisterial to his students. Whether they were his own students or those who had drifted in from other social science disciplines, they were in awe of him and often scared of disappointing him. A few years later, when I was his teaching assistant, it occurred to me and to his other students that Merton seemed, in fact, larger than life. Consistent with my training, I tested that hypothesis in a survey of students of that course, Analysis of Social Structures. Over 150 responded to the question, how tall is Robert K. Merton? There was little variance in opinion. The class average had Merton at 6'3" and a half inches in height, a full 2 inches taller than he actually was. It was true, Merton was, in fact, larger than life. Merton recruited me to graduate school in 1964, and early on I was fortunate to work with him as a research and teaching assistant. He had an extraordinary critical eye and sensibility, and he was, as I noted earlier, a meticulous editor of manuscripts. Nothing got past him. Sometimes I tried, but nothing got past him. I once misused the word stipend in a draft of a paper I was writing. I experienced then what a generation of leading sociologists had before me. Their Merton red editorial pen, and later his prolific use of stamps, each of which conveyed a substantive message. Sociology was fortunate that it had its Robert Merton, who understood so well that clear, elegant thought goes hand in hand with clear, elegant language, and who led by example in his essays, as well as in his brilliant digressive satire of learning on the shoulders of giants. This was especially so in mid-century, when sociological jargon appeared regularly for ridicule in magazines like The New Yorker. When Bob found my stipend error, and it surely was not the only one that he identified over the years, he gave me a handwritten memo many pages long on the etymology and various correct uses of the word stipend. Now that Bob's papers are available in the Rare Books and Manuscripts collection at Columbia University, researchers will find out how much of Merton's editing helped shape the arguments of many of the best works of sociology produced by his students and others over several generations. But something more needs to be done to flesh out Merton as editor. There needs to be an all-points bulletin put out to many people who benefited and were subjected to the Merton red editorial pen. We must ask them to send the Columbia Library examples of those editorial jobs that he did on their manuscripts that they still possess. If Bob was tough on his students, he was tougher on himself. nothing left his hands for publication until his own high standards were met. Often years would pass before Bob released papers for publication, sometimes reducing rather than enhancing the impact of these papers. Comparing the various drafts of his own work would prove of great value and would answer the question of whether in the quest for perfect formulations you could lose the moment of the impact in conveying an important idea to the professional and larger communities. Of course, Bob was not without his foibles. Bob had his moods that seemed to be related to how well his writing was going, writing that he began religiously about 6 a.m. every morning. After class conversations about his ideas or mine, they were always intense, but they were more or less rewarding depending upon how Bob was feeling. Now, after a while, I discovered that Bob had, as good poker players say, a tell. In those days, Bob smoked both a pipe and cigars. After many experimental trials, and I mean many, I learned that when Bob was smoking a pipe, he was accessible. I could knock on his door and wind up spending a wonderful hour talking to him. However, if Bob were smoking a cigar, I would never knock on his door, but instead do a fast about face and walk quickly and quietly out of 415 Fairweather Hall. As my relationship with Bob evolved into friendship, he continued to teach me. His instruction was multidimensional. When Joanna and I were young married, he advised us not to put our scarce dollars into works of current fiction, but instead to buy reference books. Over the years, books have come and gone in our house, but as Bob predicted, the multi-volume OED and the DMB, Strong's Biblical Concordance, and many other reference works have happily remained thanks to that good advice from a good friend. Today, of course, all of that is easily accessible through the internet. Bob's teaching in other areas was equally wise. He was, after all, the person who taught me the inestimable and transcendent value of very good single malt scotch. And nothing of interest escaped Bob's critical eye. When Joanna and I became part of his extended family, we would watch Nick games together. Bob would apply his analytical skills to breaking down opponent defenses and would occasionally jump out of his seat, much to my surprise and frustration, at a particularly stupid play by Walt Clyde Frazier or Dick Barnett, two great Nick backcourt players. Over all these years, in ways too numerous to count and too various to enumerate, Bob and Harriet have always been ready, willing, and supremely able to give good and disinterested counsel. It's a debt that cannot be repaid, and it continued well into the years when I was provost at Columbia. The last time Bob and Harriet came over for a family dinner, my 24-year-old daughter, Nani, a doctoral student in art history at Columbia, joined us. Bob and Nani were old friends and had corresponded a bit when she was at college and needed some advice about independent multiple discoveries. That evening, Bob, at 92, still standing tall and straight, had lost some of his physical energy, but not one iota of mental acuity. And quite frankly, the presence of a beautiful young woman seemed to energize him. With Bob in the lead, he and Nani began talking about the possibility of analyzing the history of art in terms of the social organization of artists. Bob delineated 3 lines of inquiry that might prove fruitful. He expounded on each of them and took Nani and the rest of us on a scholarly journey replete with lengthy detours. Afterwards, Nani told us that she was always amazed and delighted when Bob, after long excursions and parentheses, finally wove the various strands of his arguments coherently together. And so yet another generation had fallen under the spell of the Mertonian magic. I want to turn for just a moment to a more serious sociological point. As he often did, Bob was able to capture a concept in a phrase. he originated the idea of obliteration through incorporation, which can be found in his 1949 set of essays, Social Theory and Social Structure, or the idea that the origins of ideas are often lost because their content is assimilated into the general literature and the original author is no longer referenced. When Talcott Parsons actually quoted Crane Brinton at the beginning of The Structure of Social Action saying, "Who reads Herbert Spencer today?" he was referring to a school of thought that had been influential but largely rejected. If I ask who reads Merton today, I can answer positively that many scholars, if not mostly sociologists, still reference his work on the Matthew effect in science, social structure and anomie, principles of scientific discovery, and the unanticipated consequences of purposive social action. Merton continues to be referenced significantly. I did a count this past month of the citations to his work in the Web of Science and found that his work was cited fully 248 times in 2010, topping the 222 times a year earlier. So his work continues to have a substantial impact. But much of Bob's best work has not, in fact, been developed. And I don't think that it is because it has been obliterated through incorporation. It seems to me that there is a parallel concept to obliteration through incorporation, which we might call obliteration without incorporation. Now, most ideas have little lasting value and ought to be tossed away without incorporation. Most published ideas are never cited and have no impact within their own lifetime. Some ideas are resisted because they are premature or before their time and are poorly understood by the scientific community. I would count some of Barbara McClintock's ideas about jumping genes or transposons, or Stanley Prusner's ideas about prions or proteins as a cause for disease, among these premature or resisted ideas. These ideas are either eventually rediscovered and elaborated on, or by sheer force of will, persistence, and additional hard work by scientists, earn their stripes in the larger community. Merton was, of course, interested in this phenomena of resistance by scientists to scientific discovery. But I am suggesting something different here. I'm suggesting that there are some portions of the body of work of very substantial thinkers that are tossed away for no good reason. There are many original ideas that become lost artifacts of an intellectual age, which one ought to dig up and see if they are worth pursuing. If not, then let them rest in peace. Few ideas actually stand the test of time or even become obliterated through incorporation. But some are potentially powerful and are lost in the shift of paradigms, never to be retrieved except by historians of ancient works. Many ideas of one generation of scholars, which have not been rejected empirically or otherwise by the next generation or two, but that still have great potential for elaboration, are lost in the ether today. For example, Merton did extraordinary work on aspects of social structure that are largely ignored today without having been elaborated on, tested empirically, or found to be logically flawed. That seems to me unfortunate, and yet we know very little about why this happens. Perhaps the work of Bob Merton, 100 years after his birth, can become a case study for the study of the rebirth of ideas. Thank you.
I can only say that the person who is being described here is being described with remarkable consistency. The comments Jonathan and Bud have made dovetail perfectly with my own. Now I will discover whether Richard Sennett's dovetail perfectly with my own. Richard Sennett is University Professor of the Humanities at NYU and Centennial Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics. Unlike the rest of the speakers, he has never been Bob's student, never his co-author, never a fellow department member, or had some shared organizational responsibility. Like Bob, Richard defies location in the organization of disciplines. By preference, he is not a member of a particular discipline. He's not simply a sociologist, or a historian, or a philosopher, or a specialist in urban life, but his own combination of these, and, I must say, other specializations as well. His first book dealt with family structure and social mobility in 19th century Chicago. Then came a quartet of books which examined urban culture. Then a trilogy of books on welfare and social class. His Flesh and Stone, which is a terrific title, explored how beliefs about the human body shape the design of cities, lest I remind you that when we talk about moving about cities, we talk about arteries and veins. Most recently, he's been working on a series of books on the material practices of culture. Richard will tell me whether the book on craftsmanship, Craftsman, is the most recent or the next to most recent?
The most recent.
The most recent. It's a marvelous book. It deals with the human impulse that is universal and enduring, the desire to do a job well. His analyses take him to such diverse domains as architecture, the building of violins, Richard is a cellist, and Linux software. Bob read all of Richard's work attentively, and he greatly enjoyed their talks. Richard.
I'm really going to just offer you a brief footnote about Bob's place in New York intellectual life as I saw it. It seems in a way odd to celebrate Bob Merton's centenary, since he was always present to me, has always been present to me as I first knew him 40 years ago, in the fullness of his middle age and full of life. As Harriet mentioned, I was never his student, and knew him, as New Yorkers did then, through, at first, chance encounters in the rather tight, small circle of what was then called the New York intellectuals. This included his Columbia colleagues Lionel Trilling and Meyer Shapiro. Bob was part of it and not part of it. And it's that doubleness, an insider who also had the critical distance to be an outsider, which seems to me to be a kind of hallmark of his public life in New York. I should say about New York, what are called the New York intellectuals, that this was a remarkably incestuous group of people who were struggling with a trauma, which is the relationship of Marxism, its political practice, to modernism in culture. And this was not Bob's trauma. This was not something that kept him awake at night as it did Lionel Trilling or Daniel Bell. He was friends with that original generation, with the generation that followed it, which was my generation. And his attitude was one of, I would say, a kind of amused irony, something that in this incestuous family was obliterated. It was a it gave him distance, but he also, through this amused irony, was telling the people who were in this family that they had perhaps to look at themselves as though they also were outsiders. Bob had asked me when we first met, since I just started toiling in the academic vineyard, what kind of career do you want in sociology? And I answered him, I'm interested in society, but not in sociology. And this casual remark should have inflamed Bob. As you've heard tonight, he was one of the principal architects of the sociological profession as we today know it. And I think in a way his single influence was as great as the entire school at the University of Chicago, the sociologists who preceded him by a generation. But he took my cocky comment well, because I think from his earliest days he'd learned to look outward intellectually rather than inward. And to me, I think the formative experience in having this kind of doubleness of vision was the writing of that doctoral dissertation, Science Society in 17th century England. It's a book in which he applied Max Weber's idea of the ascetic Protestant ethic to the flowering of experimental science. If you haven't read it in the last few months, I just recall to you that it really has two principal thrusts. One is about the accumulation of empirical knowledge as a way of doing science, and the other, which I found so striking and still find so striking, is the notion that asceticism is necessary for the practice of good science. It's an incredibly provoking idea. As John mentioned, this book created what we now think of as the sociology of science, but it also posed a challenge to sociologists to look beyond their own normal boundaries and to get out of their comfort zone. And I think Bob was doing that throughout his life. I think it's fair to say that Bob cared for his reputation as a disciplined and disciplinary sociologist. Still, he was most intellectually aroused when he did something that destabilized the common sense assumptions of his colleagues. And that, to me, as a non-specialist in the sociology of science, is something that I experience again and again in reading him. He takes common sense and makes you think, well, I didn't really think that that was what was involved in that. But I want to say in my footnote tonight just something about this doubleness as it applied to his life in New York, and specifically to Columbia University, something I talked with him and with Harriet over the years about quite casually, and I'd just like to summarize to you one aspect of what we talked about. It's probably hard for many of you who are young to understand the pervasive anti-Semitism that pervaded American academia in the 1930s and even into the 1940s. This prejudice was not the Nazi kill the Jews sort, rather the lighter sort of English prejudice. Too many Jews about are distasteful. The sort of prejudice which appeared in T.S. Eliot's poems and essays of this period. American Jews had trouble in becoming students at Ivy League universities and great trouble getting jobs at them. Now, Columbia was no more or less anti-Semitic during these years than Harvard or Yale. But Columbia was in New York City, home to the tens of thousands of poor, talented young Jews with an academic bent, and their numbers swelled by tens of thousands of European emigres. That generation older than me had to figure out how to deal with this anti-Semitism. my friend Lionel Trilling was much more an intimate friend to me than Bob. Dealt with it by imagining a kind of fallback position he set for himself when he first became an academic. He would become an editor and a freelance writer if his life in academia were to be blocked, and particularly if Columbia proved too hostile an environment for him. Bob had no such option, as there was then not much of a free market for sociologists, nor is there now. Like many, many other Jews, he changed his Polish name when young to the Anglophile moniker that he carried most of his life. And for most of the people who did this name mask frequently failed to be protective. Bob did not hide behind this mask, and it's something that I found very moving about him. He defended colleagues, overtly Jewish colleagues, like his great friend Paul Lesersfeld, and many others at Columbia. And he was a stout critic of unearned WASP privilege. Merton's generation came to love Columbia as an institution to the exact measure it became a meritocratic university, rather than a perk for both dim and bright WASPs. Trilling, Shapiro, I. Robbie, and Merton all saw this happen in the late 1940s, 50s, and 60s. They made a home for themselves here. They were the university's meritocrats. And this was one reason why the New Left upsets of the late 60s at Columbia so disturbed them. I know it was particularly from Trilling and Shapiro, but I think Bob too. And why that activism left a more discordant trace than it did at Harvard, which had little real connection to Cambridge as a city. But Merton being Merton, he could also see beyond the disorders of his local home. He could look at these conflicts and size them correctly. He had a scientist's curiosity and fact love about why things happen, and this I think he applied to the great post-war drama of Columbia. Put simply, he kept his cool. In a way, Robert Merton's story at Columbia has been played out generation after generation in American academia. African Americans have succeeded Jews. Koreans and Indians have succeeded African Americans in making beachhead landings on Ivy League territory. We might think that universities have become more hospitable to these later landings, rather than reacted as though they had been invaded, which was very much the atmosphere that Bob and Lionel felt when they first came to Columbia. In my view, it's not quite correct, this happier story, because social class now plays something of the role that religion or race, that religion played in Merton's time. It's a barrier, I think, that's felt by white working class young people, though a barrier not so much now of outright rejection as feelings of not belonging here, of being out of place, which is also today's story of New York City, of course. It's made of the white working class a kind of foreign body in a place dedicated to success and wealth. And I think Bob was very sensible to this, that this was not a problem that was going to be solved by elite institutions. The problem would be mobile. And so I think it's proved to be mobile from religion in his generation to class in our own time. Now, there are many other things to say about Robert Merton's life and legacy. And in this footnote, I've just touched on his doubleness, only because it seems to me an exemplary way of handling the intellectual problem of narrowness on the one hand and the sociological problem of exclusion on the other. In Greek, we use the term sophrosuna. It's very hard to translate. It indicates a balanced state of conduct which navigates between rigidity and disorder, or between desire and fear. It substitutes for these polarities curiosity. Pole that he had begun, Anglophile that he seemed to become, Merton was really, I think, a classical Greek in temper. It's a good value to celebrate, and celebrating him as his 100th birthday years. Thank you.
I have no doubt that Bob would have liked to have been a classical Greek. Now we turn to Steve, my old friend Steve Stigler, who is Ernest DeWitt Burton Distinguished Service Professor of Statistics at the University of Chicago. Steve is not a standard issue statistician. It's true that he has command over all the esoteric skills that his field has developed. His research and the collegial recognition he's received attest to that. But he's a historian of statistics, which is an odd thing. Having written on the reception of quantification in the sciences and the history of statistical ideas, his impulse is to follow his quite unconventional interests wherever they take him. For example, in the study of anomalies in the fossil record, of fingerprints, or of 18th and 19th century lotteries, about which he probably knows more than anybody else, and their role in forming public attitudes towards risk. He is also the formulator of Stigler's law. Stigler's law holds that no scientific discovery is ever named after its original discoverer. Never one to let a good opportunity for irony pass by, Steve named Robert K. Merton as the discoverer of Stigler's law, thereby making Stigler's law exemplify Stigler's law. He and Bob were co-authors and had an incredibly active correspondence. I had the sense that the rate of their exchanges increased geometrically with the onset and development of email. Steve.
Well, thank you, Harriet. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a labor of love to come east to talk about Bob Merton and listen, and more importantly, listen to others. I come with a little different perspective than the others. They all have different perspectives. I come as a data point. We'll be statistical about this. I'm going to report on that data point and tell you a little bit about my experiences with Bob and show you a few pictures of things that you might encounter should you take the trip to the archives. And I can't imagine a better way to spend a weekend. Now, my first encounter with Bob was not personal, it was by mail, and it happened in 1973. My close colleague and friend Bill Kruskell had noted that in the years that I had just received tenure and come to visit at the University of Chicago from the University of Wisconsin. And I had done what many people who get tenure do, is I'd taken the freedom that it gave to celebrate by exploring into different areas, areas that I would not have gotten tenure for example, like the history of statistics. And I had written a paper, and Bill, who knew Bob reasonably well, said, send it to Bob Merton. Now, I was a little bit uneasy about that. I knew enough about the history of science then to know that when you get outside of, when you get outside of your own field and come in as a outsider, as I was in the history of science, you're not always treated kindly. On the scale of possible reactions, condescension is at the top. But I sent this paper off to Bob, and within a week or so, I got my first letter from Bob Merton. It was, "Dear Mr. Stigler," at the beginning. And by the way, I put these up not in the expectation that you'll really be able to read them. This is illustrative. "Dear Mr. Stigler," well, he liked my paper, and I think he picked up on the fact that I was having fun with some of the things while it was a serious discussion, some of the things I was talking about. And this was a real boon to a young man who was treading in dangerous territory, at least as far as any future career might go. And I must say that I very much appreciated it. And there was a brief correspondence, very short one, that followed this, not much. Things were pretty quiet for a while. The second time I heard from him after that was, in fact, when I got one of Gene Garfield's request-to-print postcards asking for more reprints, 2 copies of a reprint. And I responded, and it wasn't too long. I guess the color got washed out a little bit, but that right-hand side is I think the first official yellow Columbia stationery piece that I got, a letter in 1976. But over these years, these first few years, the correspondence was usually short, and it gave me no hint that in the next 30 years, the last 30 years of Bob's life, I would receive close to 200 letters from him, going in length up to 8 pages. I never got close to the Bud Bailyn standard. And that these letters would lead us into such interesting byways as tracing arcane phrases in the correspondence of Isaac Newton, to counting the number of grand slams according to what position in the batting order the hitter was, as an example of social structure in action. Well, the slow start had an interesting twist, though. In 1978, in I think April of 1978, one of Bob's students, Tom Gearin, wrote to me and asked me would I contribute to a second Festschrift from people not in sociology, a second Festschrift for Bob Merton. Now, this sounded sort of silly to me. I haven't yet told you, but to this point, I had not met Bob. We had never personally met. And here I was being asked to contribute to a Festschrift of someone I knew through a few fugitive notes in the mail, admired him, had read his pieces, thought he was wonderful, but he still was a distant person in my life. And I thought about it for a while, and I got an idea. And I said to Tom, yes, I would do it. And in September of that year, September 14th, I sent a draft with Tom's permission. This was not to be a total surprise to Bob. A draft to Bob. And the piece that I sent was Stigler's Law of Eponymy. And on October 4th, I got a letter, and this was the 8-page letter. I touched a nerve. He very much appreciated what I was doing. He understood and commented on the fact that what I was doing was not just fun and games, but it was at heart really a serious piece on the sociology of science. But it was a serious piece where you could have fun. And he remarked that he felt the same way about On the Shoulders of Giants, that was one of his most popular books in some ways, but it was not just fun and games. It was serious sociology of science of an extraordinarily high order. And that is why he was so proud of it. At the very end, he exploited multimedia by taping on a cartoon, which I'll magnify, from Gene's Current Contents in 1978 that Harriet had just delivered to him that day from her study They were out, I'm not sure if they were in the, no, they were not in the center. He said, remember this, Brodkin, I've got a disease named after me. You've only got a syndrome. Well, this is the first of probably 24 cartoons that I got in a similar vein over the next few years, not all from Bob. Well, the next story, and I'm not going to tell too many, the hour grows late. The next story that I want to tell involves a sequence of a set of correspondence that developed in the early 1980s, and it was centered around a particular building at the University of Chicago. If you visited Chicago and looked from the 59th Street side at the social science tea room, there's an archway that comes out for it. It's in this picture. It's not particularly readable, but there's an inscription in stone around the bottom of just below the windows that says, "When you cannot measure, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory." Lord Kelvin. Now, that inscription was placed there by William Fielding Ogburn, who was in charge when the building was built in 1928, was in charge of what inscriptions would go. He picked this as essentially the motto for modern social science, but if you look at other parts of the building, you'll find fascinating other examples. On one high frieze, there is a Smith Marchant calculator, the ultimate in computational power. There is also a caliper for measuring scalps. and there's a book. So there's a collection of things around, and this statement is one of them. Well, the reason that this came into a correspondence is that David Sills, who was a good friend of Bob's and mine, wrote to Bill Kruskal, I believe, that Ken Pruitt was going to be quoting Kelvin, and this Ken had been at the University of Chicago. He was going to quote this statement of Kelvin in his honor in his annual report. And is it true that when this statement was put up, "When you cannot measure, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory," is it true, said David, that after this was stated, as he'd heard, that Frank Knight had said, "And when you can measure, your knowledge is still meager and unsatisfactory"? And this set off a chain of letters between mostly David, and initially he sent a letter to both Bob and to Bill Kruskal. My father was consulted on this and reported that no, that wasn't Frank Knight. That was Jacob Viner, and that in fact Frank Knight had a different riposte, namely that when you cannot measure, measure anyway. But so this correspondence was going forth, and in the process, Bob produced two fairly long and magnificent letters. These are the first pages of the two of them here. The first was addressed to Bill and David. Query 1, what words of Lord Kelvin are actually inscribed on your building? He asked, a question of some interest, as it turns out. And the other one was to Bill, David, and Steve. Now, it turns out, and I discovered later in this correspondence, while we were still engaged in it, that that question, what exactly is inscribed, has some serious meaning. Those asterisks are represented on the stone as flowers, little rosettes. And in going into the archives at the University of Chicago, I discovered that they were put there in order to, because they are really ellipses. They represent dropping words out so that Kelvin's long statement will fit on the stone. This is a long statement to inscribe, and Ogburn was bound and determined that it would go there. Well, the correspondence was such fun, and it went on for quite a while, that Bob asked me to write a context for it and that we could try submitting it somewhere. And I did that. And in, I can't remember, this would have been October of 1978, I sent Bob and David my first draft, which is on the left there, a meager quest for satisfactory knowledge. And Bob replied with another long letter, which did not make it into the subsequent correspondence, which was, we heard about him as an editor. He was actually quite gentle on this occasion. He did not have much to say about the prose that joined the different segments. He did take my rather inadroit title and replace it with another one. You'll see in the red arrow there is my edition, not part of his letter, that says the Kelvin, that gave the title in which the paper was to appear, namely the Kelvin Dictum in Social Science, an excursion into the history of an idea. It was great fun, and it was not merely fun in games, although it was that too. Now, my correspondence with Bob continued over several years. It reached a peak from the late 80s to the 90s. There were over 200 full-size letters I got in that period, a lot of small notes that came, a lot of marked up manuscripts that he sent to other people, all sorts of good things. In 1991, he started using the fax machine, which is not good for archival material, I must say. And in 1996, he started using email. Now, I'm not sure that sped things up. The faxes came pretty fast. The letters came pretty fast. But the emails, once printed out, became a little more archival. Now, if you were to visit his correspondence, here is what you would find. This is just an example of some of the things that people were speaking of, and I wanted to give you some examples. You can see that a triply marked up manuscript on the left is this is actually a page of something I'd sent him. He marked it up, sent it to some other people. He then took that, marked it up, and sent it to some other people, and then he marked it up again and sent it back to me. He edited editorial remarks on one of my letters. If you look on the bottom left, it may not be too readable, but one of his stamps is there, the one that says error. And it's unusual because it's pointing at his own work. He was calling attention to the fact that he had mistakenly, in the letter that we'd already published then, referred to Lord Kelvin as a Mancunian, as from Manchester, and that was not true. And he was chagrined to discover later that was the case. But you can see this is what a correspondence with Bob was like. If you go into the correspondence, you're going to find all sorts of things. You'll find Bob's 1969 advice to an undergraduate who had asked him, how do you avoid prolixity? And Bob took a long page before he even began to address the subject. You'll find E.B. Wilson's story of how L.J. Henderson was first alerted to Pareto's work on sociology by Wheeler, and in part it was Wheeler's attempt to repair a character deficiency in Henderson. You'll find a history of social barriers to women in science. You'll find an evolution of an amazing variety of quotations, such as he encountered when he and Sills were producing the social science quotations. And you'll find what George Sarton really thought about Auguste Comte. Now, how did he do this? Now, here I want to reveal one thing that is not in the archive. This came by mistake to me in a mailing, and I never said anything about it because it was too late. It was one of his to-do lists. And that's one day at the Russell Sage Foundation. There are 20 different people that he's going to correspond to, starting with his son, Bob, and it goes on and on. I looked at the web listing of his archive and estimate that he must have had well over 1,000 correspondents who deserved and received folders. The number of single examples would surely double that if one takes the usual analyses of these sorts of things. Now, I'm going to invite you to go to those archives, but I wanted to leave you with one picture, and it's the last picture from my last visit with Bob at in his study on Riverside Drive, where we're toasting each other with a glass of his favorite single malt Scotch whiskey, the Glendronach. This was Saturday, October 16th, 2002. And so, would that I could toast Bob on this occasion, but we will all, in a sense, are toasting him here. Thank you.
I thought I would be the cleanup hitter, but I'm really concerned about time. Is it all right? Well, one thing you learn about speaking and teaching at Columbia is that there's always fire engines, police sirens, trucks rumbling by. So here it is again. I begin with a cautionary note. Counter to my professional commitments to impartiality, to assessing ideas and evidence fairly, I have to declare that I am hopelessly biased. When it comes to Robert Merton, this holds for the man, and it holds for his work. Almost 5 decades of being his student, collaborator, partner, and wife have only made me more so. Thus, I am absolutely not impartial. When thinking about this evening's talk, I, like Steve, thought it should in some way be related to the archive. Now, this archive reflects Bob's lifelong impulse or compulsion to save his research materials, correspondence, annotated reading notes, class notes, memoranda, edited manuscripts, calendars, drafts, photographs, and all manner of other materials, published and unpublished. The archive, as I've learned by looking at the finding aid available on the web, contains, and I love this, 218.74 linear feet of files. More than a dozen small card boxes, it says, and 18 large card boxes. In short, there's a lot there. Now, given the archive size, I could hardly talk about it as a whole. What I thought I would do, rather, is to comment a bit about this world of Bob, which is not so well known as his published work is, rather the unpublished Robert Merton. Much of what he wrote never saw print. Now, by way of context, he was immensely productive, by whatever criterion one might choose. His bibliography lists 32 books, and I say here one really can't enumerate the number of books, because he was really given, aside from writing monographs, to publishing in the form of collected essays. His big book, Social Theory and Social Structure, contains 21 such essays. It went through 3 different editions, was published in 2 condensed versions, appeared in 15 editions and translations. Is this one book? Well, of course, it depends on how you count and what you want to accomplish. I have no impulse to inflate Bob's productivity. I only call it to your attention. The bibliography also lists 177 papers, not counting translations and reprintings, 29 introductions, and forewords. It does not, as you have heard tonight, include the countless letters, except Steve has counted them, that Bob wrote, the number of book reviews he wrote, the hundreds of talks he gave, and what he estimated to be the 1,000 or so manuscripts by other authors, which he edited and sometimes thoroughly rewrote. I note that he was really skeptical about the importance of sheer numbers of publications in judging intellectual influence, and rightly so. But the numbers demonstrate that he was no slouch when it came to publishing. And yet there is a lot of unpublished work. The files I know show that at one extreme of the unpublished Merton, there is the catalog of the numerous files he carefully crafted for papers he would write that were on his writing agenda. At the other extreme are completed but unpublished manuscripts, put aside for a variety of reasons, often, as Jonathan said, because he judged them not to be good enough. Perhaps the limiting case of a potential but unrealized publication is a file containing a book manuscript dating 1978. It's entitled The Unanticipated Consequences of Social Action, Variations on a Theme. Bob was, as his readers know, preoccupied with the notion of unanticipated consequences. That is, consequences of actions which were not only failed to achieve their intended goals, but often produced their very opposites. This manuscript contains a long opening essay Bob wrote, as well as essays by 4 other authors. Another paper is listed in the table of contents by Raymond Boudon, then already a great French sociologist, but it's nowhere in the file. I call this the limiting case because in addition to the Mertonian manuscripts and others, there is an unsigned contract from the academic press. It was close to publication, but never made it. Then there are the manuscripts which were also close to publication. One is called The Professions, which was co-authored by William J. Good, and the other was usually referred to as The Housing Study. It hadn't gotten a title yet. This one contains the findings of research Bob and his colleagues did on the effects of social and spatial organization on the residents of 2 housing communities. Now, earlier on the continuum of completeness of manuscripts are those he judged not ready, but clearly were pretty far along. These include the paper that he and his son Robert C. Merton wrote, called Unanticipated Consequences, the theme yet again, of the reward system in science, colon. There was always a colon in Bob's papers, titles, a model of the sequencing of problem choices. Actually, Bob, as my memory has it, the paper was slated for publication, but it was pulled back by both Mertons because they thought it needed more work. Then there are the writings of the sort Bud Bailyn has mentioned that Bob called the epistolary genre. The letters, the writings which were not originally intended to be formal academic contributions, but rather as letters to friends. So, Atzog on the Shoulders of Giants was, as Bud said, originally written as a letter. Another quotes letter that I came across was written to Gerald Edelman, the neurobiologist and Nobel laureate. Consisting of 2 parts, this document runs to a total of 40 single-spaced pages and deals with the intimate connections between thinking as a genre and speaking as a genre. The letter starts off with a riff on the observation made by Mrs. Moore in E.M. Forster's Passage to India, where she exclaimed, "How can I tell what I think until I hear what I say?" This Bob called the O.L. aphorism. Why O.L.? Because Mrs. Moore was always described emphatically as old and equally emphatically as a lady, thus O.L. I don't think Bob thought of it as publishable. Others might disagree. I can't begin to guess how many other manuscripts there are in varying states of publishability. It's not a concept, like the concept Bud mentioned, that's easily operationalized. I'm fairly sure, though, that none of the unpublished work failed to see print because it was rejected by a journal editor or because Bob could find no publisher interested in it. He would have mentioned it, at least because he and I had both become very interested in the fate of rejected works. But be that as it may, he had exceptionally complicated attitudes about publication. On the one hand, no one understood better than he did how important publishing was in science and scholarship. Without it, private knowledge fails to be transformed into public knowledge. Nor did anyone understand better than he that the only way to assert ownership over ideas was to give them away. The only way to become the owner of an idea is to give it away. And if priority is at issue, you'd better publish quickly. As I have said, Bob did not take his own injunctions entirely to heart. He decided against publishing work others might have considered publishable, and he delayed publication for unusually long periods of time. He was, as we have heard over and over again, a very tough critic of his own work. Much tougher on his own work than those numerous and highly annotated, red-penned, edited versions of others' work. His reference group, though, those people whose judgments he respected and for whom he wrote, also had demanding standards. Thus he set himself a very high bar, with the consequence that there were few dull papers that were published under his name, but at the same time he did have disappointed co-authors who had to forego publication because the work simply did not meet his standard. Now, given the choice, the way to describe it is that Bob clearly preferred to get it right rather than to get it out. He was also aware that sometimes he overdid it. The book he and Eleanor Barber wrote, called The Travels and Adventures of Serendipity, was not published until 40 years after it was completed. That's 40 years the manuscript sat. This is a prime example of his reluctance to publish. It took the urging of two editors at Il Mulino, the great Italian publishing house, two women, I might add, to whom he was devoted, to persuade him to publish it. But even then, publication wasn't assured. He was convinced the book needed a new final chapter, and I can testify that he slaved over that final chapter for over a year. Then he was stymied by writing the introduction. Try as he might, he couldn't find any way of explaining why the manuscript was being published 40 years late. How could he claim the work still had value despite the long wait? Well, it was our friend James Shulman, who I saw come in, who saved the day. James, a literary historian, and then my Mellon colleague, and now president of Art Store, offered to write the introduction, and did so. Bob loved it. Thus the book was finally published in Italian, but that's another story. Then there's the Professions manuscript, which was written in the 1950s. I mention it because it was almost ready for print. Just a couple of weeks ago, I got a letter from Marco Santoro, who's a professor of sociology in Bologna, saying he'd read it and that despite the immense amount of recent work on the professions in history, he thought that the manuscript as it stands is full of conceptual insights and conceptual solutions to old puzzles, and that it should be published. Well, should it? I don't know until I read it and get the opinions of others able to judge. It goes without saying that I will try very hard to keep in mind what Bob would have said about the manuscript. His complicated set of attitudes about publication extended to believing, for example, that in that domain as well as others, there can be too much of a good thing. I'm going to skip over his wonderfully satirical description of the malignant disease known as the itch to publish. The itch to publish, of course, as he describes it, has 3 Latin names, and he outlines the etiology of the disease and its symptoms. It's quite clear that the itch to publish is definitely an infra-dig disease and not one Bob wished to acquire. Finally, in this catalog of complicated attitudes about publishing was Bob's loathing of deadlines for writing. In 1982, he wrote his self-emancipation proclamation. If I was technically better than I am, I would have had a copy to put up on the screen. I do have a copy here, and I will read you just an expurgated version of it. Having completed the last of 12 volumes to be written, edited, or revised, and some 20 articles representing the full discharge of an inordinate stock of moral, not legal obligations, which I accumulated over the years, I hereby issue a self-emancipation proclamation. In caps, to remove at long last the albatross hung around my neck in the form of ever-urgent deadlines. I declare, again in caps, that I shall not, again, agree to write, revise, or edit a book, deliver a public lecture, contribute to a symposium, write an article or a book review, or incur any of the other like our obligations which so easily accrue in the course of academic life, unless, again in caps, I have already written, revised, or edited that book, prepared the lecture, or written any of the other sundry pieces referred to in the antecedent paragraph, and to give spiritual force to this much too delayed edict by identifying the hypothetical limiting case. I further declare that should the editor of a festschrift, in honor of my oldest friend and closest friend, invite me to contribute a piece to that altogether deserved honorific volume, I shall sadly but resolutely decline to do so. Be it understood that this self-emancipation proclamation shall remain in effect until the end of my days, in the fervent hope that I shall have nothing but joy, along with those inevitable patches of suffering, in my work. Well, did the proclamation always work? Of course it didn't. 13 years later, as Bud mentioned, Bob violated the limiting condition and wrote a quite special, marvelous festschrift piece in honor of Paul called Working with Lazarsfeld. But, by and large, it did liberate him. Bob could, of course, say no. As he put it, he'd paid his dues. He'd already published a lot. But most important, he had no shortage of good ideas of his own on which to work. Now, again, I'm going to bypass the list of some 40 subjects that he published as being worthy of attention in a later paper. Because, again, time does run short. And let me close by returning to the general theme, the public and the less public Bob. I'm reminded of an exchange I had with Diana Trilling some years ago. As Richard said, Bob and Lionel were not close friends, but Bob and the formidable Diana did become good friends, and so did she and I. We gossiped a lot. Once she asked me, to my total surprise, whether Bob was as brilliant and charming in private as he was in public. I didn't hesitate for a minute and replied no. He was not. In private, he was, in fact, even better. Well, by analogy, does the same hold for his writing? Is the unpublished work better than the published? Of course not. Bob had taste, but sometimes his judgment failed. Some of the unpublished work is likely to be very good, definitely worthy of attention. This, of course, is just a hypothesis, one that this wonderful new archive will permit to be tested. Thank you.
I want to thank Harriet and the panel for these wonderful reflections on the life and work of Robert Merton. The excuse that we come together here tonight, of course, is to celebrate his life, but we also have this wonderful archive that has been processed by the librarians at Columbia and is now available for consultation by our students and researchers. It's noteworthy that what we call in our world the finding aid, the tool that used to exist in print but is now searchable and findable on the web, is over 200 pages long in its own right, which speaks to the richness and the beauty of the archive that we have to work with. And to thank Harriet for all of her support over these years that we've worked with this collection. We have made this special copy on acid-free paper in your favorite color, which I hope you'll treasure. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I'm reminded, as we've heard so much about history of science, that when Albert Einstein came to the United States, he would never travel by plane. He always traveled from city to city by train. And on one such trip, the young man came to collect the tickets, and Einstein realized he started digging in his pockets and looking for his ticket, and the young man said, "Dr. Einstein, don't worry, you don't need to find your ticket." But Einstein persisted, and he crawled on the floor, and he lifted up the seat, and again the young man said, "Dr. Einstein, please, this is unnecessary. You don't need to find your ticket." Well, Einstein stood up, whirled around, looked the young man in the eye, and says, "Young man, it is no longer a matter of whether I can find my ticket, it's a matter of where I am going." So I hope that... on that note, I hope where you will be going, perhaps, is over to the 6th floor of Butler Library. To the right, the rare book and manuscript library on the 6th floor, where there'll be something to eat, something to drink, and some aspects of the Robert Merton archive for you to enjoy. So thank our panelists tonight.